Okay, so we are rapidly approaching the end of semester. So this week and of course next week are our last two regular classes, right? And so just like I did for the midterm exam, right, where I gave you the questions and the outline of how to approach the midterm exam, so too next week I'll be giving you an outline of the questions and how to approach. I mean, it'll be the same instructions, but different questions for the final exam. Right? So just like we focused upon the two topics for the first half of semester, the midterm exam, so too our final exam will focus on the two topics that we've been looking at, so Twisted Love and Vengeance. Those sets of stories will be the focus of that final exam. Right? So next Tuesday, I will give you that handout, and the Tuesday after that will be when our exam takes place. Okay? So more details to come. All right, so we've looked at this author for a number of different stories, right? The Elixir of Life and Sarrazin and so on. And so we have our final story for the semester by Balzac, whom, as we know, is a French writer, right? We're looking at the romantic themes in his work, and he definitely is a romantic writer, but also we talked about how he is often perceived as one of the founders of French realism as well. So his stories, even though they have lots of romantic themes according to the ideas that we've seen and the way we've defined romanticism from the outset, nonetheless, they also have, even though they have these romantic things, nonetheless, one of the things you'll notice about Balzac's stories is they tend to have a much more sort of downbeat, less happy sort of endings, or sometimes quite explicitly very unhappy endings. The case of, Zombie Don Juan, for example. Okay, so these stories, I was just talking to Gustav before, he said, is it right that Balzac wrote all these short stories, most of the stories we read around the same year, around 1830? And remember, I told you he was a very, very prolific writer, right? He wrote a lot of stories and a lot of novels. So he tended to write mostly his short stories towards the beginning of his famous career. And then his later works tend to be much longer, right? So he wrote a lot of these stories. So this story from 1830, let's take a look what happens in it. Now, we've seen a number of our stories have been set back in time, haven't they? Right? So even the first Balzac story that we read was not set in the 19th century. It was set way back in the 1500s in the case of the Don Juan story, right? When we looked at the Sarrazin story by Balzac too, we saw that even though the frame story, right, the frame narrative of the ball and the Delante family and all that sort of stuff was in 1830, nonetheless the story of Sarrazin also was set back into the 18th century, right? So, and there were deliberate reasons why Balzac was doing that, right? So in the case of Sarrazin, he wanted to contrast the neoclassical artistic style that dominated in France compared to the new romantic style that was coming into vogue. This story, is it set in 1830? There are some little clues along the way that tell us it's not, right? But it's not set as far back as the Don Juan story or even the Sarrazin story. This is set back about 20 years before this, the story was written, right? And the clue is that this is set during the Napoleonic era. So when they're talking about the emperor and these armies and so on, and invading and occupying Spain and so on, all this is during the time of Napoleon, when Napoleon is setting out to conquer the rest of Europe, right? So this story is set back in time, but only by about 20 years instead of hundreds of years. Okay. So our story begins quite similarly in some ways to the Sarrazin story, doesn't it? Right? Because we have a scene where we have our main character is looking at a party, and then he's looking at something that's much more dark and depressing, and looking back at the party and looking at something, right? Just in the same way that the reader does in Sarrazin.
right? And very similar sorts of scenes as well in the Elixir of Long Life, where he has, like, you know, Don Juan is at the party, and then he goes to the deathbed, right? And then his friends come from the party into the room where his father is dying. So Balzac likes to create these scenes of contrast, right? Between celebration and life and happiness, and then, on the other hand, the opposite of that, which often is death or destruction. So we have this story set in Spain during the time of the Napoleonic, or the French occupation of Spain, right? When Napoleon is in power, and we see that you know, this young man, Victor Marchand, right, is our main he's our central character in this story. What voice is this story told in? Sarrazin, of course, was first-person narrator, who then tells the story within the story. What about this one? Third person in this case. So we don't have Victor Marchand. He's not, even though he's the main character, he's not telling us this story, is he? Right? It's told to us by a third-person narrator from outside of the story. So that's quite important, especially because, as we've seen from many of our romantic stories, right, that particularly when the author wants to emphasize the unreliability or the madness or the subjectivity or the the way in which we can't trust the narrator, he always seems to put it in the hands of the first person, whereas this one we have third-person narrator to begin. All right, so we're in this little town, Menda, in Spain. We have the main character, Victor Marchand, is looking. He's a young officer in the French army, and he's sort of like looking out over the bay, over towards the castle where there's a party happening, to where the main town is, and of course there's a curfew because they're under military rule, and everyone is supposed to have their lights out, right? Except the castle. The castle have been given a special exception to the rule, where they're throwing this party, and so they're being allowed to stay up late. Right? So there is word coming that the English, who are the allies in this case of the Spanish, right? They're helping to fight against Napoleon, right? The English are going to send some ships with reinforcements, and so the French are all on the lookout for this, but the English haven't yet arrived, and so they're still just sort of waiting to see what's happening. So this party is going on. He's out there outside, and he hears someone approaching him, and he sees that it's one of his men, one of his soldiers, right? And one of the soldiers, this soldier says, something's going on. Something's not right. Something weird is happening, right? I think we're being, we've been betrayed, or we've been attacked somehow. I'm not sure what's going on, right? And then he sees his soldier suddenly is shot, right? Sees his man die in front of him, and he looks around and he sees that there's things that are wrong. He looks out over the sea, and he sees that there are ships, which must be the English that have arrived. And he's like, oh no, this is bad. Things are not looking up, right? This looks like we've been betrayed. The soldiers might have been killed, right, while they were, on watch at night, and I'd better get out of here. And at first, his first impulse is, I'm going to be blamed for this, so I'm going to kill myself, right? So his first instinct is suicide. And he runs to go and kill himself, but then he hears Clara, right? And this is the Spanish girl that he likes, right? From the aristocratic family. And he's like, oh, does she like me? Does she not? And so in this moment, she comes and she says, you've been betrayed. All your men are dead. There's a horse at the bottom of the hill. Run as fast as you can and get on the horse and escape. Of course, that's what he does, even though her brothers are running after him. So he escapes and he goes to another French battalion and he tells them what happened. And they say, well, you know, from what you said to us, this is not your fault. We're not going to blame you. Like you were betrayed by the Spanish. You didn't do anything wrong. But, you know, the people who are higher up might not see it that way, but you know, we're willing to forgive you and to absolve you of any responsibility for it. So after hearing what had happened at Mende, the French send their army, like another lot of soldiers there, and they quickly take the town back. Right? So turns out what had happened, the ships that had arrived, the Spanish people in the town of Mende thought, oh, the English are here. We can rebel against the French now. We can kill them off. The English will come in and they'll be our reinforcements and we'll be fine. Except it turns out that the English ships that came, what was on them was like the heavy artillery, but not the rest of the soldiers. Right? So they were waiting, the English ships that were there, they were waiting for the rest of the soldiers, the English soldiers that could actually land and attack and defend the cannons and so on. They were waiting for them to arrive. They still hadn't got there. So they couldn't land and they couldn't attack. And so they were unable to help the Spanish. So of course the French guys who come in and take back the town, they are not very merciful because all of their fellow soldiers have just been murdered by the Spanish guys. And so they want their vengeance, right? They want to teach these people a lesson. They're like, you killed 300 of our soldiers, you murdered them in the night. You're not going to get away with this. So the town then makes a deal with, especially after Victor intervenes, they make a deal that the soldiers will not burn down the city, they will not kill and randomly hurt people. Instead, the blame will be put upon the family, right? The aristocratic family that lives in the castle, right? And they will take the blame for what happened. Right? So the general says, all right, I'll make this deal. Right? He imprisons the family after killing a number of people there anyway, who were the main suspects. And then he gathers together the aristocratic family, and he comes up with this rather mean, horrible scheme that instead of them being executed by a soldier, right? Instead, he hears their pleas and he says, all right, I'll let one of you survive, but the one that survives will have to execute all of the others, to kill all the members of his family, right? So this begins. Juanito is the one who is chosen as the eldest of the family, eldest son. He kills his sister first, even though Victor tries to tell her, look, if you marry me, I will get you pardoned, I will let you survive, right? So he kills her, kills the rest of his family except for his mother, and then his mother sees that he can't do it, so she goes and commits suicide by jumping off a cliff. Right? And so this ends this horrible story, and ever after, the guy, Juanito, the son, becomes known as El Verdugo, the executioner. Right? And even though he continues on the family line, nonetheless, he is horribly unhappy with his life, as you would be if you just killed all of your family. All right. So let's take a look at some of these things. Okay, so first of all, we need to understand a bit about the historical context of this, right? Remember, if you study like the history of Europe in this time, this is an era of colonialism, right? This is an era in which many of the European powers, first of all, have gone out and they have explored and conquered and taken for themselves as part of their empires various lands and places around the world, right? So obviously the British Empire is the most famous and was the largest of these empires, but they weren't the only ones, right? The French had their colonies around the world, right? This is why when you look around the world, there are various places, random places in Africa and so on that speak English or French or Spanish, right? Because of that colonial legacy, right? So the French had their own colonies, but the next biggest after the British was the, who had the next biggest empire? Not the French. Think, what is one of the biggest languages in the world? Spanish, right? So the Spanish, they had huge amounts of conquests and land that they had gained through their empire. Right? So when one of the smart strategies that Napoleon had was that when he attacked other countries in Europe, was that it meant that he was not only able to attack and to control their home resources, but attacking the Spanish and occupying Spain was smart insofar as now you had control of the Spanish colonies as well, right? Which was, meant a lot of riches and merchandise and money and so on, right? So it's a smart move as well. Now, one other thing that's at play in this background is what is Victor's background? Where does he come from? I mean, we know that he's French and he's from Paris, but what is his social background? And he talks about this when he's thinking about, oh, could this Spanish girl, Clara, could she be interested in me? Would she marry me? What does he think? What is his reservation? What is his social class? What's his background? Yeah?
He says, but could he dare to believe that the daughter of the proudest noble in Spain would be given to the son of a Paris university?
Right, so his father is a grocer, right? He sells fruit and vegetables and so on, right? So is that a rich, high-class kind of? No, it's not, right? So Victor comes from very humble sort of beginnings, right? Humble sort of origins. He's a commoner. He's not aristocratic. He's not rich, and yet here he is, an officer in Napoleon's army, right? And this is one of the curious things about Napoleon and about this Napoleonic era, is because we sort of think back of Napoleon as being sort of like this sort of dictator with a psychological problem, psychological torment from his what we call short man syndrome, of being short and therefore he wants to be powerful, right? But Napoleon, would not have been as successful if that was all there was to him, right? He was a smart guy, right? But he also was successful because he had what might be called a very meritocratic approach to things, right? He used and promoted people based upon their merits, upon their talents, right? Now, remember, that this is right after the French Revolution, right? And the French Revolution was a revolt against aristocracy, against having your family determine what your perceived social value was, right? So being born into the royal family or being born into the house of a lord and lady, right? Those often were the markers that gave you social privilege. It meant that you could become, a top general or, a great politician or an important person in the church or any of those other sort of prestigious positions. Whereas Napoleon, he approached this from the perspective that there are talented people and there are untalented people. And you could have an equally talented person from the common classes as you could from the aristocratic classes. So a lot of the soldiers, and particularly the leaders in Napoleon's army, were given those positions not because, oh, you're from this family, oh, you're the son or daughter of, I guess it'd be the son in the military, the son of this lord, right? Instead, Napoleon used this meritocratic system of choosing his soldiers and choosing particularly his officers based upon their merits and talents. And this is part of why his armies were so successful, right? Is that they were talented, right? They were really good at what they did. And so what we see with Victor is that even though he's a son of a grocer, even though he's from this low background, nonetheless, he manages to achieve this relatively prestigious position of leadership, right? So one of the things that's being contrasted here in this story, and is part of this Napoleonic background, is that there is this social change that is happening. That this isn't just a story about like these two forces of the Spanish and the French coming together. This is also about social forces, about the aristocracy versus the commoners, and how those two stack up against each other, right? How those two different mindsets and two different classes, how they think and how they operate. Okay. So a lot of this is contextual, quite a lot in the background, but is very important to understanding this overall story, right? So these Napoleonic Wars, of course, Napoleon, he came to power in the late 1790s, and he eventually was defeated finally in 1815. So nearly 20 years, he was quite successful in his campaign to rule over France and extend his empire over Europe. Now, one of the other things that happens with the Napoleonic Wars, and one of the great sort of ironies of this time, is that when the French soldiers, they would go out and they would conquer Italy, Spain, and other places, and when they did so, they would stay. The soldiers would stay in the houses of the common people, of the regular people, right? So this is what happens in this story too, right? Is that many of the soldiers are staying in the houses of the Spanish people in this village of Menda, right? And that's how they're able to be murdered, right? Is that their hosts, like the people whose houses they were living in, obviously killed them, right? Is what happens in this story. Now, one of the reasons why this is historically so important is that these soldiers under Napoleon, right? Napoleon still saw, even though he was a dictator, nonetheless saw himself, ironically, as being an embodiment of those ideals of the French Revolution, right? Of, remember the three: liberty, equality, and fraternity, right? The slogan of the French Revolution. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, right? And on top of that, in addition to that, is a new value of this time too that we take for granted in our world, but is just on the rise, is that of what we call nationalism, right? People don't necessarily see themselves as being, oh, I'm so proud to be Korean or Canadian or Chinese or French or whatever it is, right? We take that for granted that you're supposed to have some sort of loyalty and love for your country, but this is a new phenomenon that is starting to occur in this time period, right? So we see a lot of talk in here about like the French and the Spanish, right, as these two opposing cultures in the story. But this also is something that is new and that is actually spread around Europe, ironically, by the conquests of Napoleon, right? So let's say Napoleon's soldiers are staying in a village, and they will tell, like the villagers, like, oh yeah, this is the values of the revolution, and we're so proud to be French, and we're all this sort of stuff. And of course, the effect that this has then is like the Spanish or the Italians or whoever they've conquered say, well, we should be proud to be Italian. Let's kick these French out, right? Let's get rid of them. So this kind of has the unintended consequence. But nonetheless, it spreads these ideas through Europe, right? This is, you know, this is why the French Revolution is so influential, right? Is because of Napoleon, ironically, right? His conquests, his military tactics, they spread the message of the revolution to the common people, to the rest of Europe in ways that couldn't have happened without those historical events, right? So the Napoleonic effect and the Napoleonic Wars, they are a big part of the context of this. Now, remember at the time that Balzac is writing, though, right, and this is 1830, right? This is still, like, remember, we've seen 1830 as kind of a turning point in this period, because we saw there was another revolution, what's called the July Revolution, that happened in 1830, right? Which was mentioned in some of the other stories that we've read. But remember, we saw that we have the French Revolution, we have the reign of Napoleon, and then 1815 we have what's called the Restoration, right? In which the French tried to go back to having a king and tried to go back to having aristocrats, and this only lasted for about 15 years. It's surprising it even lasted that long, right? Because that regime was very weak. No one believed in it anymore. The values of the French Revolution and those social changes had been too much to go back to the old style, the old way of doing things. And so eventually the July Revolution occurred, and they shifted to a new kind of government. But what happens, of course, in the immediate aftermath of Napoleon is that, and the years afterwards, and still the time that when Balzac is writing this, is that Napoleon is now seen as the bad guy, right? He's like, he was the guy that led us into all these wars, and he was the dictator, and he betrayed the revolution, right? And all these sorts of things. So the time that Balzac is writing, there's a big sort of, first of all, anti-Napoleon feeling, right? So Napoleon is seen as the bad guy. And secondly, there is, with the Romantics, there is this beginning of a kind of a reassessment, a rethinking of Napoleon, right? Of seeing sort of, in that very Romantic sort of way, of seeing the two sides of Napoleon, right? Just like we talked about, most Romantic characters have these sort of two opposite characteristics to them. You can look at them in two different ways. So Frankenstein's monster can be seen as a hideous, horrible monster, and at the same time, when you actually get to know the monster a little bit more and see how he thinks, you're like, no, there's something quite humane and compassionate about the Frankenstein monster as well, right? And they're together in these two characteristics in the same character. Well, the same thing sort of happens with how a lot of these writers see Napoleon, right? They look at Napoleon and they think, wow, he was a great general. He was really smart. He was really talented. But he also betrayed all of that, and he became a dictator, and he made lots of other mistakes, right? So there's this kind of Romantic rereading of Napoleon that goes on during this time. And Balzac is doing something similar here as well. Okay, so that's a lot of historical context to take in, but it's quite important, as I said, for understanding the background, the context of this story. It's not just this very simple sort of story. It has a lot of contextual meaning to what's going on here. Now, just as we saw these Romantic contrasts earlier on in the semester, so too this story plays with a lot of the same kinds of like oppositions and opposites in the way in which it approaches these stories, right? So, for instance, we constantly have emphasized for us that France and Spain are right next to each other. Their cultures are not that radically different, and yet, even their languages are both Romance languages, and nonetheless, the mindset, the culture, even the appearance of the Spanish compared to the French is constantly emphasized for us by Balzac, right? He wants to set up this contrast between these two different ways of thinking and looking at the world as far as he sees it, right? And remember, this is that rise of nationalism, right? And also that use, as we saw with the way in which some writers use the Italians as well, right? They say, oh, well, Italian culture, we saw this as those theories that are prevalent at this time about how climate and weather changes the way in which people think, right? So we saw that like the further north you are, the colder it is, and therefore the more rational you're supposed to be, and then the further south you are, the more passionate and warm and emotional you're going to be. Now, of course, this is all nonsense, but it's become a sort of a stereotype because of this theory that arose in the 18th century. So the contrast between the French and the Spanish, they're presented to us as being two different ways of thinking, right? Even within the story, right? The Spanish are alternately shown to us as either being highly noble or deeply treacherous, as being highly civilized or as being savages, right? And they're called both depending on which part of the story we're looking at, right? Because they're called savages after they murder the French soldiers, but we also see that the Lessanges family is referred to as like being sophisticated and civilized and so on. Secondly, we see, of course, the contrast between two sets of values between the nobles, right, who are, of course, the aristocratic family that we see, Clara's family, right, and then the commoners, right, who are represented by Napoleon's army and, of course, particularly by Victor, right. So there's a sense in which, like, this story is kind of giving us almost like a rerun, if you like, in miniature of what happened in the French Revolution, right? Because, of course, the French Revolution saw a lot of bloodshed, a lot of executions, and most of those executions were of people who were of aristocratic birth, right? So Balzac is sort of like saying, well, let's do a rerun of that French Revolution. Let's see whose values, let's see whose ideas, let's see which class and whose ideas are prevalent here, right? Which ones are winning? Which ones are more important to this society? Okay. We also see a constant contrast between men and women, although particularly it's mostly between Victor and Clara. Although we also see, of course, the mother, right? Remember, she kills herself at the end, and they're all the soldiers who are looking on are like, wow, she was a tough woman, right? She was, so they're all very admiring of her. And there's this sort of, it builds into that last of those contrasts there between loyalty and betrayal, right? So, you know, how does this play? We'll see in the last of these of the slides that there is the question of loyalty and betrayal is much more complicated in this story than it first appears, because there are certain things that people do that in the story that contradict the way in which the things that they say and the ways that they behave in other parts of the story, right? Sometimes even right next to each other. Okay, now there's also a question here about responsibility. Like, how do we decide who is morally responsible for an action? Right? And this we've seen a lot in these romantic stories, right? So think all the way back to Telltale Heart, right? In which the narrator is talking about like how he is sane, he is rational, he takes responsibility for what he did, right? Even though we can see that he's crazy. And being crazy, of course, means that before the law, you're not responsible for your actions, right? That's what the consequences of the law are. So in this case, we have two moments, right? Two particular moments that are crucial to this question of responsibility. The first one is we see when Victor goes to his superiors after he escapes, and he tells them the story of what happened in the town of Menda, right? What do they say to him?
Do they say, this is your fault, we're going to shoot you for betrayal? No. Instead, they say to him, right, at the bottom of 208, I think you were more unfortunate than criminal, replied the terrible general, when at last he spoke. You are not responsible for the crime of those Spaniards. And unless the marshal should think otherwise, I absolve you. Right? So he's saying here, like, this is not your fault. You're not responsible for the deaths of the French guys in the town. Right? You didn't do this. This is not that you've made some bad mistake or that you've done some sort of error. It's just, you're unfortunate. And so I'm absolving you of responsibility for it. Now, the second example we have, of course, is that of the son Juanito, right? Who has to execute his family. Right? Now, is it his fault that he kills his family? There's a whole big question here, because on the one hand, he could say, no, I'm not going to do it, and then all of his family dies, don't they? Right? He included. So if he says, no, I'm not going to execute my siblings and my parents, then all of his family dies. Right? And he does, of course, say, yes, all right, I will do it. And he kills his family, except for his mother, who kills herself. Right? And how do people see it? How do people see him after this event for the rest of his life? Yeah, they call him the executioner. So even though he kind of doesn't have a choice about it, right? Even though he sort of, it's against his will, he doesn't want to kill his family, nonetheless, he ends up getting this title of the executioner, right? And for the rest of his life, he feels this guilt about what happened. Right? So there is this interesting question that Balzac raises for us about like the way in which humans take their responsibility for these things. We see Victor, he's worried that he's going to be blamed for this. And so the general says, well, in my opinion, it wasn't your fault, right? The Spanish betrayed you. He says, Napoleon might see it other ways. He might still have you shot, but I can't do anything about that. But I'm going to argue that it wasn't your fault. And then we see the Juanito at the end of the story, right? After all these events, he also has this question of responsibility, but instead of, like, we would say he's not really guilty. It's not his fault. He didn't kill his family willingly. He did it for the best interest. And in fact, his family tell him, like, stay alive, so you can have children and keep our family alive, keep our family name alive, right? He, nonetheless, feels this horrible burden for what he's done. Okay. And then finally, I want to talk about this idea of reversal, because as I said, there are some big contradictions and certain sequences, chains of events that are linked together that create some certain paradoxes in the story. And this particularly applies to the character of Clara, right? So we see from the very beginning of the story that Victor's sense, his instinct is that, I think this girl likes me. Right? Remember, there are these social barriers between them, right? She's Spanish, and he's a French soldier, right? So they're on enemy sides. So already there is something that is keeping them apart, right? Even if they were attracted to each other. And then on top of that, she's an aristocrat from a rich family. He's the son of a Parisian grocer. He's a commoner,
He's not rich, right? So he sort of is like, oh, does she like me? Does she not like me? Yeah, she wouldn't marry me. Come on, she's a Spanish noblewoman, and I'm just a poor son of a grocer, right? Even though I'm an officer in the French army. Right? So already the sense that Clara likes this guy, right, and that he is picking up some sort of signals from her that she's interested in him and he's interested in her. There's already on both those sides is a kind of psychological betrayal, isn't there? Right? Because she shouldn't be like, she should hate this guy, right? He's a French guy. He's a commoner. He's nothing to do with her, right? And yet she's attracted to him. And in turn, he has, like, he's betraying his, his army and so on, that he's like, oh, I like this Spanish girl, right? So there's already this initial betrayal, or the sense of the possibility of betrayal that comes about by this initial attraction that we see at the beginning of the story. But the real crux of this, the real crucial part of this, is what happens right after Victor sees the man who comes with the message, and the other man gets shot, right, and dies, and he goes to kill himself, right, just like the mother does, right, goes to jump off a cliff, and who stops him? Clara does, doesn't she, right? And she tells him, right, that go and run. She says, oh, this is on 208 as well. Cold sweat rolled from the officer's brow. He wore no sword. So he's not even got a sword with him to protect himself. He was confident that his soldiers were murdered and the English were about to disembark. He saw himself dishonored if he lived, summoned before a council of war to explain his want of vigilance. Then he measured with his eye the depths of the descent, and was springing towards it when Clara's hand seized his. Right, so he's about to throw himself off the cliff. Right, he sort of like looks down. Yep, I will go and throw myself off it. Clara grabs his hand, and then she says, "Fly," she said. "My brothers are following me to kill you. Your soldiers are killed. Escape yourself. At the foot of the rock over there, see, you will find Juanito's barb." Barb is a kind of horse, breed of horse. Go, go. She pushed him, but the stupefied man looked at her motionless for a moment. Then, obeying the instinct of self-preservation which never abandons any man, even the strongest, he sprang through the park in the direction indicated, running among the rocks where goats alone had hitherto made their way. Now listen to this next bit, is so wonderfully contradictory. Here we have Clara grabs his hand, stops him from killing himself, right? Run over there, take my brother's horse, escape. Then he heard Clara calling to her brothers to pursue him. He heard the steps of his murderers. He heard the balls of several muskets whistling about his ears. But he reached the valley, found the horse, mounted him, and disappeared with the rapidity of an arrow. Right? So here, Clara, on the one hand, she comes and she saves his life one way, right? She stops him from jumping off the cliff. She then saves his life a second way by telling him, go down over there, follow the trail down, and there's a horse waiting. You can steal my brother's horse, and you can escape. So she saves his life twice, and then in the process, as she saved his life, she is calling out to her brother saying, "There he is! Go get him! Shoot him!" Right? So her actions go like in two different directions, in two contradictory ways, right? Where on the one hand, she is saving Victor's life. On the other, she appears to be trying to get him killed by her brothers. Now, think about the consequences, not just in this moment that it has for Victor and Clara, but also what we find out later on happens in the story. She knows that if Victor escapes, he's not just going to be like, "Oh, well, that was nice. I'll go back to my family and back to the..." No, she knows that if Victor escapes, right, the French, he's going to go to the rest of the army, they're going to come back, and they're going to take their vengeance on the town. So if Clara had not saved Victor, right? If she'd let him die, if she had been just loyal to her country and to her family, then none of the rest of what happens in the story could have happened, could it? Right? So sure, the French might have come back in and conquered Mende, but they wouldn't have known about this betrayal. Right? So, what has happened here is saving of Victor by Clara. Ironically, she becomes the agent that allows her family and even herself to die, doesn't it? Right? If she hadn't saved him, she could have had a chance of saving her family and all of the rest of what happens. Okay, so we see a similar thing, reversal that happens, as we mentioned, to Juanito, the brother, the executioner, right? Where even though he doesn't really have a choice as to what he's doing, even though he's just following his duty, nonetheless, and he's like, wow, he's not like, yay, I get to survive, right? Woo, I don't die, right? Because normally you'd think, yay, it's great to be alive, right? I survived being executed. Instead, he's like, and understandably so, he's like, I survived. Why didn't I just die with my family, right? Is his feeling. So there's this reversal. Even though he survives, even though he's the one that comes out of this alive, that nonetheless, his feelings are the reverse of what he would want. Okay. All right, so let's turn now to our homework sheets and see what are some of the ideas that you guys picked out from this story, and see if we can add further to this ideas. Namhae, why don't you begin today? What did you pick out?
Page 208.
208?
Kind of like the last conversation. No, 212.
212.
It's kind of like the last conversation between Clara and Victor.
Mm-hmm.
It's at the moment that Clara will get executed by her brother, and the Victor comes in screaming that the general grants your life if you will marry me. But anyway, Clara asked the brother to go on and kill her. I think it's because this is like a form of vengeance that Clara wants to make some Victor, because kind of like Clara let Victor go in the first place, because and if he didn't do that, if she didn't do that, her family would have survived. So I think by doing this, Clara let Victor no place, no way to make up for her.
Mm-hmm.
Make up for what he had done.
Okay. Yep. So, but it doesn't really make up for it, does it? Right? Because her family is all still pretty much dead, and she's the first one to go. Right? So, I think we kind of need to explore here Clara's motivations. Right? Why does she tell Victor to run away, and why does she help him to escape? What does Victor assume?
That she likes him?
He assumes this, doesn't he? But does the text tell us that?
No.
It doesn't tell us that, does it? She doesn't say, I love you, run away and we can be together. Right? She doesn't say anything like that. Instead, she just gives him she tells him, run away, my brothers are after you, this is how you can escape. She doesn't express any sort of love or sentiments or anything to him. And remember that the feelings that we see expressed early in the story are just Victor's speculation, right? He's like, oh, I think she might like me. But he doesn't know about this. Right? Now, remember what I said about this question of the commoner values versus these noble aristocratic values. This is quite, as I said, it's very important for this story. Right? Now, of course, the reality of how aristocrats behaved is often quite different to the ideals that they were supposed to have, right? Because today, of course, if we use this term noble, do we say, numbhead did a noble action? Do we mean aristocratic? No. What do we mean by noble today when we use this word?
Decent.
Decent, yeah, like morally good, right? And particularly, it has this sense of unselfish, doesn't it? Right, unselfish, right? So there's this sort of sense of being unselfish and morally good that is attached to this idea of noble. So a noble cause or a noble deed, excuse me, today has these senses, right? Now, for these two classes that we're talking about, the commoner and the aristocrats, or the nobles, right? The nobles were supposed to, or this is the way that they idealized themselves, is that they were supposed to be following this kind of noble mindset, unselfish, right? Decent, morally good, and this is how they rationalized the fact that they were the rulers, right? That they were the upper classes. It was like, whoa, we're helping, we're looking after you guys, right? Now, as I said, often this didn't work in practice, but the ideal of the noble, right? The ideal of the aristocrat was to be unselfish, to be decent, to be a good person, right? To care for others. And so this is what we see in the character of Clara, right? Is that Victor comes from a different class and a different background. He's a commoner, right? And this is a debate that goes all through the 18th century and into the 19th century in European society and literature and so on. Is this question of the common values versus the noble values, right? And do they line up with each other, right? Can commoners be noble in the moral sense, right? And aristocratic characters, can they might be more self-interested than they make out, right? So are they really what the values hold to be? And so the dominant position has tended to be the commoner position, right? The position of the ordinary person, right, over the aristocrat. And so aristocrats tend to be demonized as being bad and evil and so on in a lot of novels and literature from this time. But here, Balzac takes a somewhat different perspective, right? This family, right? This family turns out to be true to that value of the nobles, right? We find out it wasn't really them who murdered all those French soldiers, but they are unselfishly taking the blame for it, right? And similarly, we see Clara, when she tells Victor to run away, she's not doing it out of self-interest. She's doing it because she has this noble sense that this guy, he shouldn't just be murdered, right? He shouldn't just be killed by her brother. He should have a chance, right? It's a decent thing to do to give him a chance to get away. And then it's also a decent thing that he should be killed by her brothers because, he's a foreign invader. So this is part of what this mindset of the noble, this unselfish, decent sort of person that Clara idealizes herself to be, and that comes from her whole family, right? This is this noble aristocratic ideal that she's trying to live up to, right? So the difference between that aristocratic mindset and the commoner mindset, or the bourgeois mindset, is that of self-interest, right? So the commoner is seen within this paradigm as being appealing to self-interest, right? Appealing to things that you can get from other people. And so this is the way in which Victor, of course, he sees it. When he comes to her with the marriage proposal when she's about to be beheaded, right? And he's like, yeah, but just marry me and then you'll live. She's like, I'm a noble. I don't do things for self-interest, right? I'd rather die. And so she stays true to her set of values and dies rather than marry him out of self-interest. So, as I said, this historical context, it's not something that it's easy for us to relate to because we now live in a world where we don't have aristocrats and common people for the most part. Like no one that you will meet today will be aristocratic, right? Even though they still do exist, there's still the British royal family and stuff like that. In our everyday lives, we don't think about these things anymore. But in the time that Balzac is writing and the time of the Romantics, these social changes are still happening, right? There are still these quite stark and quite important social divisions between aristocrats, between nobles, lords, and so on, and the common people, and two different sets of values that are associated with them that are sort of still negotiating between themselves, right? You can see this much more commonly in someone like Jane Austen, right? Where Jane Austen is trying to balance certain values of the aristocrats, certain noble values that she likes, with certain values of the commoners that she also likes. And right, she tries to create characters that manage to take the best parts of both of those systems. Because the century before is certainly a lot of animosity between those two. All right, so this is a really important thing to understand about Clara's character, is that she is representing this noble ideal of her class, and that she is not taking part in this sort of like game, or that she's being selfish or any of those other sorts of things, or that she is in love with Victor. None of those things really apply, right? It's part of this aristocratic mindset that she has of behaving in this noble way, even when it goes against her apparent self-interest. Okay, let's see, Charlie, how about you? What did you pick out from this story?
On page 213.
Yep.
The ending is quite out of my expectation because I thought Giannico might just accept this result and maybe prepare for another revenge.
Yes.
Yeah, I thought maybe he would do this, but he just felt overwhelmed, like awaited for death.
Yep.
Yeah, so, but I think this is as you have said, is the different opinion of commoner and noble.
Yes. Yep. So he kind of continues to do his own duty, doesn't he, by the family, right? So he has this sort of, even though his life has been ruined by this event, right? Nonetheless, he sees it as his duty to keep on living and to try and continue the family name, even though he sort of now he's not happy with his life and he's just sort of waiting for death to come for him, right?
Yes, and this reminds me of some ancient Chinese novels.
Yeah.
Many of the characters, they will just endure this kind of burden and try to revenge almost So I think it's quite different.
Yes. Yeah. It's also the other difficult thing is like there's no there's not really anyone directly that he could take vengeance on, is there? There's not like one villain. I mean, I guess he kind of doesn't even know about Victor and his place in all of this, does he? The only thing he could do would be to keep fighting against the French, whom we might see as the general enemy. Yeah. Okay, Hira, how about you?
I chose the last paragraph too.
Yep.
Like you mentioned before, what's quite interesting is Juanito had done it to preserve the family name, but eventually he lives in sorrow awaiting his death. So I wondered just to keep the family name, was it worth all the killing of his family? So I just wondered about that. And I wondered in that period of time, was it really important to preserve the name as well? So I just thought those questions.
Well, it is a curious question insofar as we've as we've talked about, like the aristocratic system is one that is in decline, right? It's one that is like particularly from the French Revolution onwards, is one that is in decline. And so by the time we get to the 20th century, right, this system is starting to really fall apart. And today, no one cares about aristocratic lines and all that sort of stuff. We don't say, oh, you know, hero, like, can you trace your family back to, you know, William the Conqueror or whatever? You know, we don't do that kind of thing, right? We don't care. Like, no one cares about those aristocratic kinds of bloodlines anymore, right? Except for like the royal family and stuff like that. But, you know, for the most part, people don't care about this stuff anymore. And so the actions of the family to preserve their line, right, historically, it kind of is ironic because, you know, soon no one is going to care about these things anymore. No one is going to care about, like, you know, which family you came from and whether you preserved the name and all that sort of stuff. So there is a certain historical irony to this as well, because in the long term, like, now no one cares about that stuff. No one would, yeah, doesn't matter, and all that sacrifice would be in vain. Yep. Okay, Justin, how about you?
I kind of contrasted what you were talking about, the conflicting values of Clara, like when she saved him, and she kind of tells her brothers to kind of shoot at him, and then also when Victor says, if you marry me, you can be saved, and then she just goes on with being executed. I pretty much talked about what you said, how it contrasted and what her true feelings were, right? And you couldn't get to a conclusion. After you talked about it, I think it was right.
Okay, makes sense to you now? Okay, good. All right, thank you. Sharon?
I chose page 207. He's talking about the lights and how they're celebrating, like, the feast of St. James. I think in the story, light, like, symbolizes truth because it reveals. And in the story, light is used, like, as a signal for the Spanish to rebel against the French army. So it, like, reveals his true intention, and the ball is kind of like a mask to, like, hide your real flag. And and like St. James was also executed by sword, like the aristocratic family. So I don't know if there's.
I'm sure it was chosen for that reason too. Yep, absolutely. Yes. So yep, we see the choice. The Feast of St. James is, in this case, we'd say is a reference to another text. So it's chosen deliberately by Balzac to have that connection. And yes, as you said, there's the lights, and we've seen this in, of course, many of these romantic stories. The use of light and dark as symbols, and the way in which these reveal certain things. Of course, the English ships are an important sort of background part of the story, and we find out that no one knew, like, about their position, right? Everyone thought, oh, the English are coming, they're going to save us, right, in the town. And it's only revealed later, oh, it wasn't the whole of the English, it was only a part of their army and they couldn't land, right? That's why they didn't help. Okay, Suryan?
I chose page 207. The first when he, Victor is thinking of Clara, moonlight is shining and stars are bright and only flowers sleep. I think it matches like how he feels toward Clara. Because it's hard to get moonlight or stars amongst the flowers. It's hard to get. It's hard to get Clara's like he gets his Clara. It's hard for him to get Clara.
Yes. Okay. And how does the beginning of this story, how does that contrast with the end? Is it the same sort of feelings? Notice that Balzac gives us opposite feelings, doesn't he? So the story starts, oh, it's so calm, quiet, meditative, and wonderful. oh, this night is so beautiful, and there's, you know, you can smell flowers, and, right? So there's always a very peaceful, calm, relaxing kind of scene. And then, of course, like the end of the story is traumatic, right? Everyone dies, and except for the oldest brother, in this horrible, grisly sort of way. So, like, Bowles like sets this up, doesn't he? So that the beginning of the story is in direct opposite contrast to the end of the story, right? So these feelings, the scene that we have at the beginning, it's meant to be sort of begin, oh, this is going to be a nice story. Oh, this is, oh, so sweet. It's such a nice night. It's so beautiful out. And then, of course, it turns out to be rather different in the end. Okay, Isleta?
I chose page 210, the 7th paragraph, kind of where they're talking about like dinner with served, where it starts with dinner with served, and I think also like the contrast, because it, like at the end, like Victor is thinking, not Victor, but the story is like saying how it's a big contrast between like now the nobles are going to be killed, and it's a contrast between like the story in the beginning when everything was so nice and pretty and they were so happy. And I think it also shows kind of like how quickly things can change in a short amount of time. Because it says like it was only like 2 days before where everything was so nice, and now they're getting put to death.
Yes.
And it like shows how fast time changes.
Yeah, there's a sentence there. 2 nights before, he had seen the heads of the 2 young girls and the 3 young men turning giddily in the waltz. So this is when they were having their dance and their party, right? And now, of course, he mentions specifically their heads, right, which are about to be, his hands were dancing, and now cut off. Okay, good, thank you. Jan?
I'll pick the second paragraph on page 212. 212. So it describes the scene right before the execution, and I thought that it was quite impressive how the religious ceremony kind of was done before the people were executed. So I picked this paragraph because it is the scene of the highest tension throughout the story. And as a reader, I was curious whether Johnny 2 will kill everybody or leave someone out. So I also paid to the last sentence, which Barjac described the family member of Higgins as genuine Spaniards who don't lose honor or their loftiness until their end.
Yes, so this is that noble quality that we're talking about, isn't it? Right? And also at the beginning of that paragraph too, it's we have that sort of ironic reversal insofar as, like, you know, when you have an execution in this time, you have, of course, the priest there, right? And the priest is there to give the last rites and to any confessions that they want to make, and also to comfort, right, the person who's about to be, or the people who are about to be executed. Say, like, you made your confession, you made your peace with God, now you're going to heaven, right? Except that we see that the priest, like, you know, priest usually has to spend most of his time comforting the people who are going to die. Instead, what does he spend his time doing? He's comforting the guy who's not going to die, right? He's like, that's the most traumatic part of the story, right? So it says, one member alone, pale, undone, leaned upon the priest, who spent his powers of religious consolation upon this man, the only one who was to live, right? So the guy who's not going to die is the one that the priest has to spend most of his time consoling. It's going to be okay, you know, it's all right. You know, and because, of course, usually it'd be the people who are going to die that would be the most upset and that would need the priest the most, right? So Balzac uses that reversal there as well. Okay, we're out of time for today. Thank you, guys. See you next time for our Pushkin story of the shot. And I'll see you then. Thank you.